The 80th anniversary of the Allied victory in World War II approaches. In this apocalyptic conflict, the Soviet-German front was the main battlefield. A theatre of epic proportions, stretching over 2,000 miles from the Arctic to the Black Sea. It was a war of attrition, mobility, and logistics, fought in extreme conditions that tested the limits of both the Axis and Soviet armies. In this war, two determined regimes clashed. There was no compromise, there was no mercy. It was not about annexation, but about annihilation. It was either them or us. The human trauma, both military and civilian, reached unprecedented proportions. The Western Allies should never forget the terrible price paid by the Soviet people to make victory possible, of whom not a single family remained unscathed, if they remained at all, and deep scars persisted for entire generations. Nor should the Axis Allies forget the fate suffered by their countries, especially Germany, where only devastation remained at the end of the war 80 years ago. As time passes, memories fade. New generations tend to forget history, or worse, try to rewrite it. But back then everyone knew, and Western leaders could well appraise the Red Army's actual role in the war. In October 1944, Churchill stated, "I have always believed, and I still believe, that it is the Red Army that tore the guts out of the Nazis." In 1945, General MacArthur said, "The scale and grandeur of the Russian effort mark it as the greatest military achievement in all history." All prominent figures in the Allied Supreme Command, beginning with Roosevelt and Eisenhower, made similar statements. In this video, we'll focus on military strategy and policies on this decisive front. We will summarize the major operations from the initial invasion to the final collapse of the Third Reich. As always, maps and support documents are taken directly from primary sources and archival data. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers rushed into a battle that had been presented to them as different from all the previous battle. It would indeed be so. Operation Barbarossa had many unique features, and as such, it occupied a special place in military history. Never since the wars of religion had a military conflict been so ideologized. On both sides, political troops, the SS and the NKVD, pursued their own objectives. Nazi Germany presented this war as a pan-European crusade, calling on Axis armies and contingents from the occupied territories. On their side, the Soviet Union brought in the communist parties everywhere it could. The Wehrmacht and the Red Army were, by far, the two largest military instruments of the time. In total, some 10 million men, along with tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft, clashed during the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa on a territory equivalent to the entire Greater Reich. This conflagration gave rise to hyperbolic military statistics, the largest encirclements, the most spectacular breakthroughs, and the most brutal clashes, and the most improbable reversals too. How did the Red Army, a clumsy monster destroyed twice, rebuilt twice, manage to save itself from a disaster that seemed inevitable to the whole world? And how did the Wehrmacht manage to push its efforts to the point of literally falling to pieces? As military historian Jean Lepage rightly says, do we know in the entire history of wars of such levels of self-inflicted blindness by military and political leaderships regarding events of such magnitude and with such important consequences? Like Stalin, who seemed the only one surprised by an attack that was taking shape right before his eyes, day after day and for months, and about which countless informers and foreign leaders, including Churchill himself, warned again and again. Or like Hitler, who refused to see that his adversary, flung to the ground, would find the strength to rise again and strike back. On both sides they were lulled by illusions. They underestimated the adversary and overestimated their own forces to a point that defies all military common sense. Operationally speaking, Germany's strategic goal was the rapid destruction of Soviet forces through blitzkrieg, fast-moving, concentrated mechanized attacks designed to encircle and annihilate the Red Army. The Barbarossa offensive was largely devised by Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff. It was Halder who refined the operational plans into a three-pronged assault, aiming for Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the centre, and resource-rich Ukraine in the south. The Germans divided their attack into three army groups. Army Group North aimed for Leningrad, an industrial hub, a symbol of Soviet resilience and the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the north, Leonid Govorov and Andrei Yeremenko faced the full weight of Hermann Hoth's armoured formations driving toward Leningrad. Yeremenko, commanding the Bryansk front, tried desperately to form a line against the advancing Germans, suffering a wound in the autumn battles. Leningrad was soon encircled. Govorov, in charge of its artillery defences, would become the bulwark that held the city through its darkest hour of the siege. Army Group Centre targeted Moscow, the political and logistical capital of the USSR. Commanding the central drive was Fyodor von Bock, a conservative strategist with a rigid adherence to orders. His Army Group Centre, supported by the panzers of Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, unleashed a blitzkrieg of staggering proportions. Smolensk fell by mid-July, and Moscow loomed on the horizon. Guderian, ever the advocate for swift armoured thrusts, pushed for an immediate drive to Moscow, but Halder and Hitler diverted him south to assist in the gigantic encirclement at Kiev. Army Group South sought to seize Ukraine, rich in food and resources, and later push into the Caucasus for its precious oil. Further south, Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group sliced through the Ukrainian steppe, linking up with Guderian's armour in a textbook pincer movement that devastated Soviet southwestern front. Meanwhile, Friedrich Paulus, still a staff officer at OKH, played a critical planning role in coordinating logistics and encirclement strategies that underpinned German operational success. His time for field command would come later. The Soviet response in the early days was marked by confusion, contradictory orders, and Stalin's initial refusal to believe the invasion was real. Semyon Timoshenko, the People's Commissar for Defense, attempted to coordinate counterattacks from the western and southwestern fronts, but these were poorly executed and often crushed in German cauldrons. The German advantage lay in superior coordination, training, and tactical doctrine. The Soviet Union, despite numerical superiority, was caught unprepared. Stalin's purges had crippled the Red Army's leadership, and Soviet logistics were slow and outdated. Initial German advances were rapid, capturing Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev within months. However, terrain and logistics soon became major obstacles. The vast Soviet plains allowed rapid movement, but poor roads and logistical overreach impeded and slowed German supply lines. At the beginning, Germany deployed 3.8 million troops against 5 million Soviets, but Soviet forces were disorganized. Smolensk in July 1941, Kiev in September 1941, and the siege of Leningrad that began in September 1941 and would last until January 1944. The Germans had planned for a swift victory, but Soviet resistance, supply issues, and the sheer scale of the territory meant that by autumn their momentum was already slowing. The Red Army, despite suffering heavy setbacks, managed to slow the German advance, particularly around Smolensk and Vyazma, buying precious time for reinforcements and reorganizations. It was in this epic struggle that Georgy Zhukov emerged. Initially serving as Chief of the General Staff, he had warned Stalin of the impending threat. After the disaster at the Western Front, Zhukov was removed from the General Staff and sent to take command in the field. His leadership at the Yelnya salient, east of Smolensk, marked the first time the Red Army recaptured territory from the Wehrmacht. It was a small but symbolic victory, and the first glimmer of the tenacity Zhukov would soon be known for. Meanwhile, Ivan Konev, commanding the Western Front during the Smolensk battles, saw his forces encircled and nearly destroyed. Stalin was ready to have him removed, but Zhukov intervened, recognizing Konev's potential. It was a decision that would pay off in later years, although relations between both men always remained conflictual. Pictures of unimaginable debacle come to mind as we figure out this first period of the war for the Soviets. Heat, dust, disorganized columns of men, trucks, tanks ramming about, troops without orders or with contradictory ones, trying to reach some objective that was changed long ago, haggard faces of soldiers, frustration, anger and tears. However, on the German side, the opposite. Euphoria, confidence in the eyes of soldiers, whose commanders think their blitzkrieg will conquer the best part of Russia in a matter of weeks. As they advance, they leave behind immense fields littered with the wreckage of thousands of tanks. More than ever, the Wehrmacht seems invincible. By October 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. However, autumn rains turned the roads into mud, slowing German supply convoys. By November, temperatures dropped dramatically, freezing oil and immobilizing tanks. The Germans were ill-equipped for winter warfare, but it would be an error to assume the Soviets were in their natural element. The so-called General Winter was largely neutral and didn't give the Red Army more than a marginal advantage. If the Wehrmacht was ultimately pushed back, it was first of all because of the resilience of Soviet troops and the quality of the leadership in key armies and at the General Staff. The Red Army parade in Moscow's Red Square for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution took a very special turn in this year. The marching troops and tanks did not return to their barracks and parking areas, but directly to the front lines, just a few kilometers away from the Kremlin. The soldiers knew that they were the last line of defense, and the USSR's capital was behind them. Stalin had chosen to stay in Moscow, even though most of the administration was evacuated. Every single Soviet citizen understood the gravity of the hour, and they raised like one man to save their motherland, as it is sung in the Sacred War, a song that became legendary thereafter. The Soviets, however, had learned from their defeats. Reinforcements from Siberia, trained in winter combat, arrived. The Stavka, now led in part by Alexander Vasilevsky, reorganized Soviet defenses with great efficiency. Then came the Soviet winter counteroffensive. Launched under Zhukov's command and coordinated by Vasilevsky, the Red Army struck a stunned German force around Moscow. Under General Zhukov, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive in December 1941, pushing the Germans back 100 miles. Hitler refused retreat orders, leading to heavy German casualties. The German supply chain was overextended. Winter clothing and fuel shortages crippled operations. The Soviets amassed 1.1 million men for the counteroffensive against a depleted German force. Moscow's railway hubs allowed rapid Soviet reinforcements. Walter Model, called in to stabilize the crumbling German lines, earned his reputation as Hitler's fireman by organizing a stubborn defense, withdrawing in good order where others had collapsed. By the end of 1941, the German war machine had failed to deliver the decisive result it promised. The pictures that come to mind are a sharp contrast of what they were 6 months before. First mud, then snow, and extreme cold. If not yet confidence, at least a look of defiance, an unbreakable will to resist can be seen on the faces of Soviet soldiers. They know that Moscow is right behind them, and they won't retreat any further. The German command has pushed as far as it could against a stiffening opponent. Fighting harder for each mile of advance, Army Group Center has strained its forces to a breaking point. As the Soviet offensive unleashes from the very gates of Moscow, it is now the turn of the Germans to put on haggard faces, as their retreat soon becomes a rout. Men and materiel are reeling from the cold, as those who still have the will to fight back find their weapons useless, with frozen grease inside the mechanisms. After it failed to take Moscow in 1941, the German High Command knew a new strategy was required. Hitler and Holder fiercely debated over the next move. Holder argued for a renewed, focused offensive towards Moscow, but Hitler overruled him, demanding a southern campaign to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. The result was Voll Blau, Case Blue, an ambitious plan to split Army Group South and drive towards Stalingrad and Baku. Von Kleist advanced into the Caucasus with 1st Panzer Army, driving for the oil-rich city of Grozny. But the Panzer Grenadiers eventually bogged down in the poor mountain roads, harassed by an invisible enemy. As the Alpinjäger plant German flag on the summit of Mount Elbrus, it looks more like a sporting victory than a military one. Meanwhile, Paulus was given command of 6th Army, tasked with securing Stalingrad on the Volga. Supporting him was Hermann Hoth, leading the 4th Panzer Army. In September, Holder was replaced by Zeitzler, who had even less power to resist Hitler's increasingly erratic interference. The Soviets, meanwhile, were still in recovery mode. Vasilevsky and his brilliant frontline counterpart, Konstantin Rokossovsky, who had returned from political disgrace, began to revise the Soviet operational doctrine. Defense in depth, maskirovka, deception, and carefully timed counteroffensives replaced the costly frontal attacks that had bled the Red Army in 1941. As German forces stormed towards Stalingrad in August, Andrei Yeremenko and Vasily Chuikov became the central figures in the defense. Yeremenko, commanding the southeastern front, was tasked with organizing the regional resistance, while Chuikov took direct command of the 62nd Army inside the city itself. What followed was one of the most brutal urban battles in history. In Stalingrad, fierce urban warfare turned the city into a symbol of resistance. The German 6th Army under General Paulus faced brutal house-to-house fighting, with Soviet forces under General Chuikov expertly using the city's ruins for defense. Chuikov's strategy was simple but effective. Get close to the enemy, hug them as he called it, so German artillery and aircraft could not be used without hitting their own troops. Street by street, building by building, the Soviets fought to deny the Germans full control. Paulus, constrained by Hitler's insistence on total victory, continued to grind forward. As the German High Command fixated on Stalingrad, Zhukov and Vasilevsky were planning a major offensive. The operation, codenamed Uran, would not attack Stalingrad directly, but rather the exposed flanks of the German army, held by weaker Romanian forces. On the 19th of November, Operation Uranus began. Within days, Soviet pincers met at Kalach, encircling 6th Army. Paulus pleaded for a breakout, but Hitler refused. Supplies would be flown in, he insisted, a logistical fantasy that even Zeitzler knew was impossible. He reportedly went on a hunger strike to protest the decision, refusing to eat more than Paulus's men. As 1942 drew to a close, Paulus's 6th Army was starving, freezing, and surrounded. Operation Winter Storm, an attempted relief by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, failed under intense Soviet pressure. The Red Army, largely defeated for over a year, was finally beginning to dominate the battlefield. A reversal was coming, and 1943 would prove it beyond doubt. The new year began with a catastrophe for the German Sixth Army, trapped within the ruined city of Stalingrad. In late January 1943, Paulus became the first German field marshal ever to surrender. With the fall of Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht lost not only an entire army, but also the aura of invincibility that had surrounded it since 1939. The architects of that victory were Zhukov, Vasilevsky and Rokossovsky, who had coordinated the encirclement and the follow-up operations with growing precision. Chuikov, whose 62nd Army held out in the city against all odds, was transformed from a tenacious general into a Soviet hero. Meanwhile, Nikolai Vatutin, leading the Voronezh front, continued to press the offensive westward, driving the retreating Germans with increasing ferocity. Von Kleist had to evacuate the Caucasus in earnest before the Red Army reached Rostov, narrowly avoiding an even more catastrophic encirclement than Paulus had at Stalingrad. In response to Vatutin's advance, Manstein launched Operation Don, a brilliant counterstroke aimed at stabilizing the front, followed by a daring maneuver near Kharkov. It was one of the last operational victories of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, a masterclass in mobile warfare. Manstein's success, however, could not conceal the strategic truth. Germany was now on the defensive. At OKH, Zeitzler struggled to manage the growing demands of the Eastern Front with shrinking resources. Hitler assigned to Model the mission to contain the Soviet efforts around Leningrad. His meticulous defensive preparations slowed Govorov, who had been steadily applying pressure since late 1942, trying to break the siege. While the full lifting of the blockade would come later, the first breaches occurred in early 1943, improving supply and morale within the city. By summer, Hitler was eager to regain the initiative. His hopes were pinned on Operation Citadel, a large-scale offensive aimed at eliminating the Kursk salient. The plan called for a pincer movement. Manstein's forces, led by 4th Panzer Army, would drive north from near Belgorod, while Model, now with 9th Army, would push south from Orel. Yet Soviet intelligence and reconnaissance, aided by partisan activity and decrypted German communications, had given them full knowledge of the plan. The Soviet response was unprecedented. Zhukov and Vasilevsky ordered the construction of deep-layered defences, including thousands of kilometres of trenches, minefields and artillery positions. Rokossovsky and Vatutin would command the northern and central defence, while Konev, who was becoming increasingly prominent as a Red Army commander, prepared to lead the counter-offensive. Operation Citadel was launched in early July. The battle that followed at Prokhorovka, one of the largest tank engagements in history, saw the German offensive grind down under fierce resistance. The Soviets, having absorbed the first assaults, responded with a crushing series of counterattacks. Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south. The defeat at Kursk marked the end of German offensive capacity on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, they would fight only to delay the inevitable. In the latter half of 1943, the Red Army surged westward, liberating Smolensk, Kharkov and finally Kiev in November. Vatutin's first Ukrainian front executed a brilliant crossing of the Dnieper River under fire, a feat that would make him one of the war's most admired operational commanders. By the end of 1943, even Hitler recognized the danger. He relieved Manstein, who had repeatedly clashed with the Führer over strategic priorities, and increasingly leaned on commanders like Mödel and Heinrizi, who had proved themselves masters of defensive warfare. The Red Army was no longer a reactive force. It was a relentless juggernaut, advancing with coordination, overwhelming firepower and growing skill. The Germans for the first time were truly fighting a war they could not win. By 1944 on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. Though still capable of resistance, it was outnumbered, outgunned, and strategically on the defensive. The initiative belonged completely to the Red Army, whose generals had matured into confident, battle-hardened leaders, with a deep understanding of both offensive strategy and logistical coordination. The year began with continued Soviet pressure across multiple sectors. In the north, in January, Govorov finally shattered the German siege of Leningrad, ending one of the longest and most brutal blockades in history. To the south, Vatutin launched winter operations aimed at liberating western Ukraine. Spring was a time of preparation. Under the strategic leadership of Vasilevsky, Zhukov and Rokossovsky, the Soviets plotted the gigantic Operation Bagration. It was to be launched in June, perfectly timed with the Western Allies' D-Day landings in Normandy, tying down German reserves on both fronts. The operation was designed to annihilate Army Group Center, then commanded by Heinrizi. Out of compassion for his troops, he had asked for permission to withdraw to more defensible positions, but his requests were denied. German defences were thin, poorly supplied, and overexposed. Bagration began on the 22nd of June, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa. Rokossovsky managed to impose his carefully planned strategy on Stalin, and the result was devastating. Within weeks, the Red Army had destroyed Army Group Center, just like the destruction the Wehrmacht had wrought during Barbarossa 3 years earlier. Just as in 1941, entire divisions vanished into encirclements and got scattered in the forests. But this time, it was German divisions. Zeitzler was dismissed as Chief of Army General Staff shortly after the disaster. Further south, Konev, Zhukov, Tolbukin and Malinovsky advanced into Poland and the Balkans with speed and precision, prompting Romania and Bulgaria to switch sides and causing chaos in German rear areas. By the end of autumn, Soviet forces were at the gates of Hungary and Yugoslavia, linking up with local partisans and opening a direct route into Central Europe. As the new year dawned, the Red Army stood deep within Polish territory. The once invincible Wehrmacht was reeling. Colossal Soviet offensives of 1944 had obliterated Army Group Center, driven Germany's allies from the war, and brought the front line to the very threshold of the Reich. Now, in 1945, the Red Army would lead its final assaults. The year began with the Vistula Oder offensive, launched on the 12th of January 1945, led by Zhukov and Konev commanding the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts. It was a masterpiece of manoeuvre and deep operations. In just 3 weeks, the Red Army reached the Oder, a mere 70 kilometers from Berlin. For the Wehrmacht, the situation was critical. It fell to Gotthard Heinrizi, reassigned to command the defences of Berlin's approaches, to organise a rational, flexible defence. Heinrizi, a deeply experienced defensive strategist, prepared formidable fallback lines and conserved his forces where he could, knowing full well that Berlin could not be held indefinitely. Rokossovsky, now leading the 2nd Belarusian front, advanced through Pomerania, closing on Berlin from the north, mopping up resistance and sealing the flanks. Operation Berlin was the last grand Soviet offensive of the war. Stalin, eager for symbolic dominance, pitted Zhukov and Konev against one another in a race for the capital. The result was a furious assault on 2 axes of advance. Zhukov attacked from the north across the Zilo Heights, an extremely well-fortified position held by Heinrizi. Meanwhile, Konev broke through in the south, pushing towards the city's southern suburbs. By April 1945, Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, refused to surrender, ordering a last-ditch defence of the city. The Red Army, numbering over 2.5 million men, launched a multi-pronged assault, engaging in brutal urban warfare. German defences, composed of exhausted remnants of Wehrmacht and SS divisions, and even teenage and elderly Volkssturm militia, were no match for the Soviet onslaught. As Soviet troops entered Berlin, Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, formerly the 62nd Army that once defended Stalingrad, now fought street by street through the German capital. In Stalingrad, Chuikov was denied the final capture of Paulus. In Berlin, he had his full revenge, as on the 2nd of May, Chuikov accepted the unconditional surrender of Berlin's garrison. A week later, Germany surrendered. Pictures of hardened, seasoned Soviet soldiers who had seen everything, who got to know the savagery of this war, who had become masters in tactics, just like their commanders have become masters in strategy, their eyes filled with determination. The endless white plains of Poland, crossed by never before nor after seen flows of Soviet tanks, seizing areas of thousands of square miles in no time, far more than any German blitz from the years before. The loud spring of Berlin, where the sounds of birds chirping and gunfire engulfed the city all at once. For the last time, fire, smoke, madness, all hell let loose. And then silence. An abrupt silence. An eerie silence. Relieving for some, frightening for others. Tears of despair for the defeated, tears of joy for the victors. But in the eyes of all, tears from recalling everything that had befallen them in this terrible war, a war like no other, a war they would nor could ever forget. The war on the Eastern Front was decided by grand strategy, industrial power, and resilience. In the end, the Red Army proved capable of adapting and overcoming early disasters to secure final victory. The terrible human price of this war should never be forgotten. The Red Army broke the back of the Wehrmacht, accounting for at least 80% of its total losses during World War II, in both men and materiel. Estimates put the German military losses at around 6 million, against 9 million for the Soviet. But the Soviet people paid at least 3 times more. Overall, the Soviet Union suffered the highest casualties of any nation in World War II, with estimates ranging from 27 to 40 million, military and civilian together. The Soviet-German War was unlike any other war in the history of mankind. Its outcome shaped the world and remains one of the most studied conflicts. It continues to reveal its dramatic pages as new information is constantly discovered. Peoples of the world should never forget what this terrible word means: war.